I am Kiara, 35 years old, and a forensic accountant who built an empire entirely in the shadows. I always knew marrying into Atlanta high society meant dealing with elitist snobs, but I never expected my own mother-in-law to literally push me over the edge. Handing her my ultrasound photo was supposed to be a moment of joy. Instead, she sneered, tore the photo in half, and shoved me off a hotel terrace, claiming I faked my pregnancy for my husband's $12 million trust. As I lay bleeding in the bushes, my husband did not call an ambulance. He called his lawyer. Before I reveal how I took away everything they valued, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family that thought they could break you. The evening air on the private stone terrace of the St. Regis Atlanta was crisp, carrying the faint, rich scent of expensive cigars and Vivian's overpowering, suffocating floral perfume. Inside the lavish ballroom behind us, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft, elegant hum of a live string quartet provided a seamless soundtrack for the city's wealthy elite. But out here, away from the prying eyes and the fake smiles of the guests, the atmosphere was thick with an undeniable toxic tension. I stood a few feet from the low ornate stone railing, my fingers nervously smoothing down the fabric of my maternity dress. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs. For months I had endured Vivian's thinly veiled insults, her constant biting reminders that a girl from the south side of Atlanta had absolutely no place in her pristine old money world. But tonight was supposed to change things. I was carrying her grandchild. I genuinely believed that a new life, a continuation of their precious family line, would finally bridge the massive gap between us. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the small, glossy ultrasound photo. The image was a little grainy, but the tiny, perfect curve of my baby was unmistakably clear to me. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I stepped toward her. Vivian stood perfectly rigid with her back to me, looking out over the manicured, sprawling grounds of the hotel, a glass of expensive champagne resting loosely in her flawlessly manicured hand. I spoke her name softly, holding out the photograph, as if it were a peace offering. She turned around slowly, her cold, calculating gaze sweeping over me with the familiar mixture of absolute disdain and profound boredom. When she finally looked down and saw the photo in my hand, she did not smile. She did not gasp in delight or pull me into a warm embrace. Instead, she snatched the delicate image roughly from my fingers, holding it up to the dim, flickering light of the terrace lanterns. I watched her face closely, foolishly waiting for the softening of her harsh features, waiting for the beautiful realization that our family was growing. Her upper lip curled into a vicious sneer. The absolute revulsion in her dark eyes sent a sudden freezing shiver straight down my spine. "You expect me to believe this blurry printout entitles you to a dime of Jamal's $12 million trust?" She spat, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper dripping with pure venom. The words hit me so hard they felt like a physical blow to the chest. I stood there completely stunned, my mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated malice radiating from her. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend myself, to tell her that I did not care about Jamal's supposed money, but she cut me off before I could utter a single syllable. "Pack your cheap bags, you lying fraud." Before I could even register the threat in her voice, Vivian's hands moved with a shocking, violent speed. She gripped the edges of the ultrasound photo and ripped it straight down the middle, the sharp tearing sound cutting through the quiet night air like a knife. She threw the torn pieces directly at my chest, letting them flutter to the stone floor. Then she stepped aggressively into my personal space and shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, my spine colliding painfully against the low stone railing. The rough, carved stone bit deeply into my lower back, instantly knocking the breath out of my lungs. I grabbed the edge of the railing to steady myself, my mind racing in absolute panic. "Did you really think a Southside nobody could trap my son with a fake belly?" she snarled, leaning in so close that I could smell the sharp tang of alcohol on her breath. Her eyes were wide, manic, with a deeply rooted classist hatred that went far deeper than simple maternal disapproval. She genuinely believed I was an imposter, a lower-class parasite trying to siphon off their generational legacy. I tried desperately to step away, my hands instinctively moving down to cover and protect my stomach. Vivian, stop, please, I gasped, trying to find my footing on the smooth, polished stone floor. But she was not listening to reason. Her toxic rage had completely consumed her. With a sudden explosive surge of strength, she shoved me again, driving her palm squarely and brutally against my shoulders. The sheer force of the impact threw me entirely off balance. My heels slipped backward on the polished stone. For a terrifying, endlessly weightless moment, the world simply vanished around me. I fell backward, tumbling over the edge of the terrace. Gravity violently took over, pulling me down into the consuming darkness. I crashed brutally into the thick, decorative hedges a full floor below. The stiff branches whipped and tore mercilessly at my exposed skin, snapping under my weight, but they also acted as a harsh cushion, breaking my fall just enough to keep my neck from snapping against the hard earth. Pain exploded instantly through my chest and back, a blinding white-hot agony that completely stole the breath from my lungs. I tasted warm copper in my mouth as I lay trapped in the dense, thorny foliage, staring up at the towering stone wall of the terrace. Every single breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. Through the high-pitched ringing in my ears, I heard the heavy glass terrace doors swing open above me. Frantic footsteps hurried across the stone. Jamal. My husband had finally come out. I tried to call out to him to scream for his help, but all that escaped my trembling lips was a ragged, wet, pathetic gasp. I forced my heavy tear-filled eyes to focus, peering up through the tangled leaves. I saw Jamal leaning over the stone railing, looking directly down at me. A massive wave of relief washed over me for a fraction of a second. My husband was here. He would save me. But he did not yell for help. He did not run frantically toward the exterior stairs to reach me. He just stared downward, his face an unreadable, terrifying blank mask. Vivian stepped up smoothly beside him, casually brushing a microscopic piece of lint from her rented designer gown. She looked down at my broken body with cold, detached, almost clinical precision. She tripped trying to extort us. Vivian said, her voice perfectly level, utterly devoid of any human panic or remorse. I watched my husband, the man who had stood at an altar and promised to protect me, the man who knew with absolute certainty that I was carrying his unborn child. I waited for him to scream at his mother, to pull out his phone and frantically call the police, to do absolutely anything that resembled love. Instead, Jamal nodded slowly, his expression hardening into cold calculation. He reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out his cell phone. He rapidly dialed a number and pressed it to his ear. "I need you to draft some emergency separation papers," he said quietly into the receiver. "Yes, right now. It is urgent." He was calling his lawyer. Not an ambulance to save his bleeding wife. Not the police to report his mother, his lawyer. The sheer, horrifying magnitude of that betrayal paralyzed me far more than my freshly broken ribs ever could. They were going to leave me here to die in the dirt. They were going to willingly let my baby perish just to protect their fragile social status and their crumbling bank accounts. Suddenly, a sharp, terrified scream pierced the heavy night air. A hotel waiter had stepped out onto the lower patio for a quick smoke break and spotted my body tangled in the bloody hedges. He dropped his silver tray, the loud, chaotic crashing of shattering plates echoing into the night, and began screaming frantically for help. He pulled out his security radio, shouting desperately for an ambulance, his voice trembling heavily with pure panic. Sirens began to wail in the far distance, growing steadily louder and more urgent as the darkness began pulling aggressively at the edges of my vision. Paramedics rushed onto the lower patio, the bright, erratic beams of their medical flashlights blinding me as they carefully and urgently untangled my broken body from the sharp branches. As they hoisted me onto a firm medical stretcher, a sudden agonizing cramp ripped violently through my lower abdomen. I felt a warm, terrifying trickle slide slowly down my leg. My baby. The singular thought echoed in my fading, panicked mind, a desperate, silent prayer to a God I hoped was listening. The paramedics shouted complex medical terms to one another, swiftly strapping a plastic oxygen mask tightly over my face. The world was fading rapidly to black, spinning wildly out of control. But right before I lost consciousness entirely, the phone buried deep in my coat pocket vibrated. It was a distinctive, heavy, continuous buzz. It was a high-level emergency fraud alert from my highly encrypted private banking application. Through blurred, heavy, failing eyelids, I managed to reach down and pull the phone out just enough to see the brightly glowing screen. It was an automated notification from my private server. Jamal had just attempted to drain our joint checking and savings accounts. While I was bleeding out on a stretcher fighting for my life and the life of our unborn child, my husband was ruthlessly executing a coordinated financial attack to take every last dollar to his name. The bright screen faded into a dark, blurry void, and the very last thing I felt before slipping into unconsciousness was the freezing, calculated realization that my entire marriage had been a lethal, meticulously orchestrated lie. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit forced my eyes open. A sharp, localized agony radiated through my chest with every shallow breath. Monitor alarms beeped in a steady, sterile rhythm next to my bed. Dr. Evans, a stern-looking woman in her late 40s, stood at the foot of my bed, holding a digital tablet. She informed me I had 3 broken ribs and severe deep tissue bruising from the fall. My hands instantly flew to my stomach as I braced for the worst news possible. Dr. Evans offered a small, reassuring smile and told me the ultrasound confirmed the baby was perfectly fine, nestled safely with a strong, rapid heartbeat. A profound wave of relief washed over me immediately, followed by cold, calculating clarity. Jamal and his mother wanted me destroyed. They wanted my child gone. I looked directly at the doctor and demanded a strict privacy lock on my medical file. I instructed her that absolutely no one in my family was allowed to access my room or receive any updates regarding my condition or the survival of my baby. She nodded, understanding the gravity of my request, without asking unnecessary questions, and flagged my chart as restricted. Not 10 minutes after the doctor left, the heavy wooden door to my room pushed open. My privacy lock had clearly not processed fast enough through the hospital administration system. Chloe walked in clutching a pathetic bouquet of wilted carnations that smelled faintly of a gas station checkout counter. My white sister-in-law possessed a masterclass ability to hide her venom behind a perfectly crafted sweet southern smile. She approached my bed with exaggerated caution, projecting an aura of fake sympathy that made my stomach churn. She set the cheap flowers on my tray table and sighed deeply. "Jamal is just so devastated about your miscarriage, Kiara." She cooed, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "He simply cannot bear to see you right now. He needs space to grieve the loss." She reached into her oversized designer tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them right onto my lap. Her tone shifted instantly from mournful to strictly transactional. "Jamal knows you are going to need help with these expensive hospital bills," she said smoothly. "If you just sign this post-nuptial separation agreement, the family will generously cover your medical expenses and give you a clean break." I ignored the searing pain in my ribs and picked up the papers. My years as a forensic accountant had trained me to speed read complex contracts. It took me less than 30 seconds to spot the trap. The document was not a simple separation agreement. It was an ironclad waiver designed to strip me of my rights to all marital assets. Even worse, buried on the 3rd page was a liability release clause. By signing it, I would legally absolve Vivian of any criminal or civil responsibility for pushing me off that hotel terrace. They were trying to buy my silence while leaving me penniless and completely legally vulnerable. Chloe stood over me, tapping her manicured fingers impatiently against her leather purse. "Just sign the back page and I will get out of your hair," she urged. I looked up at her, maintaining absolute terrifying eye contact. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or offer her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I calmly asked her to hand me a pen. As she leaned forward to pass me a silver ballpoint, I deliberately knocked my elbow against the tray table. The heavy ceramic mug of scalding hot tea tipped over, pouring dark, steaming liquid directly onto the stack of legal documents. The hot tea soaked through the thick paper, instantly turning their carefully drafted escape plan into a ruined, illegible mess. Chloe shrieked and jumped back to avoid the splashing liquid, her sweet facade completely evaporating. "Are you insane?" she yelled, staring at the ruined paperwork. I pressed the red nurse call button pinned to my bedsheet. A security guard and a nurse entered the room seconds later. This woman slipped past the front desk. I told the guard, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "She is harassing me and causing a disturbance. Please escort her off the premises immediately." Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but the stern look from the security guard silenced her. She grabbed her designer bag and stormed out of the room, her face flushed with pure rage. The room had barely settled into silence when the door opened again. This time, it was not a hostile family member. Desmond stepped inside, bypassing the main reception entirely by using his access card for the staff elevator. My corporate attorney and most trusted ally moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency. He placed my heavy encrypted work laptop onto the overbed table and pulled up a chair. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I entered my complex security credentials and accessed the specialized forensic software I use to dismantle corrupt corporations. Jamal had always paraded around Atlanta boasting about his $12 million family trust fund. It was the shield his mother Vivian used to look down on everyone else. But Jamal attempting to drain our joint checking accounts while I was bleeding out on a stretcher had exposed a massive vulnerability. Billionaires do not steal spare change from their wives unless they are drowning. I ran a deep invasive trace on the routing numbers associated with the family estate, bypassing the superficial banking layers and digging straight into their core holdings. The progress bar inched across the screen, finally revealing the true financial architecture of my husband's family. I stared at the data, the terrifying truth washing over me in cold waves. There was no $12 million trust. The accounts were empty. The family business was a hollow shell crippled by massive unsustainable debt and fraudulent accounting practices, but it was far worse than simple bankruptcy. I pulled up the internal audits and spotted the glaring red flags. Jamal and Vivian were running a massive securities scam, artificially inflating their company's value to secure illegal loans. They were completely broke and facing imminent federal fraud charges from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Their entire life of luxury was an elaborate, desperate lie constructed on stolen money and fragile ego. The sterile hum of the intensive care unit faded into the background as I stared at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. Every keystroke peeled back another layer of the meticulously crafted illusion my husband and his mother had sold to Atlanta high society. The pain in my broken ribs throbbed with every shallow breath, but the adrenaline surging through my veins kept my mind razor-sharp. Desmond sat beside my hospital bed, his eyes tracking the cascading lines of data with the quiet intensity of a predator cornering its prey. We were looking at a financial graveyard. The $12 million trust fund Jamal constantly used to silence my opinions and inflate his own ego did not exist. It was a phantom ledger. I pulled up the internal accounting records for their primary holding company. It took only a few moments of running my specialized forensic software to expose the rot. Jamal and Vivian were operating a massive, desperate shell game. They had been artificially inflating the value of their commercial real estate portfolio for years, using ghost properties and fabricated lease agreements to secure massive loans from private banks. They were using new loans to pay off the interest on old loans, bleeding cash at an exponential rate. But the most terrifying detail was the red flag flashing across my screen from a recent Securities and Exchange Commission inquiry. They had crossed the line from terrible business management directly into federal fraud. The walls were closing in on them, and they were entirely broke. Desmond leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing as he traced a complex web of recent wire transfers. "They are drowning," he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of professional awe and deep disgust. "Look at these default notices, Kiara. They are weeks away from everything collapsing. The federal government is already sniffing around these inflated asset reports. If they do not inject 8 figures into this holding company by the end of the month, they are going to federal prison." I scrolled past the default notices, searching for the lifeline. Criminals like Jamal and Vivian did not act this arrogantly unless they believed they had a solid escape route. They had just tried to murder me on a hotel terrace to protect their wealth, which meant they believed a massive payout was imminent. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing their rudimentary internal firewalls to access Jamal's highly restricted executive inbox. There it was, a massive pending corporate acquisition. A private equity firm had agreed to buy their bankrupt, worthless estate for exactly $12 million. It was a total buyout, a golden parachute that would instantly pay off their fraudulent loans, silence the federal investigators, and allow Vivian to keep her sprawling mansion and her precious country club memberships. Desmond pulled up the final acquisition paperwork attached to the email. The contracts were fully drafted, just waiting for the final signatures scheduled for the end of the week. He scanned the buyer's information, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Then he stopped completely. A low, dark chuckle escaped his throat. He looked up from the screen, his eyes meeting mine with an expression of absolute poetic disbelief. Kiara Desmond said, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. The anonymous private equity firm stepping in to buy their bankrupt estate. The firm that is going to hand them $12 million and save them from a federal indictment. It is Vanguard Equity. The name hung in the quiet hospital room, heavy and absolute. Vanguard Equity. I leaned back against my pillows, ignoring the sharp sting in my chest, as a cold, terrifying smile touched my lips. Vanguard Equity was my company. It was the shadow firm I had built from the ground up, entirely funded by the massive wealth I had accumulated through years of high-level forensic accounting and corporate restructuring. Before I ever met Jamal, before I ever stepped foot into Vivian's toxic, suffocating world, I was already a self-made titan. But I had kept it entirely hidden. When Jamal and I first started dating, he paraded his old money lineage like a weapon. He took me to exclusive galas and introduced me to people who looked at my simple dresses and quiet demeanor with undisguised pity. Vivian had made it her personal mission to remind me that I was a working-class charity case. I remembered a specific dinner where she loudly criticized my sensible shoes, boasting about her generational wealth, while I sat silently knowing I owned the exact commercial high-rise where we were eating. I hid my extreme wealth behind offshore blind trusts and proxy directors because my instincts told me that Atlanta society was crawling with grifters. I just never imagined that the biggest, most desperate grifters of them all were the man I married and his mother. I had protected my assets from them out of caution. Now that caution had handed me the ultimate weapon. I looked back at the screen, the pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapping into place. I opened the banking application on my phone, pulling up the fraud alert I had received just moments before I passed out on the stretcher. Jamal had attempted to drain exactly $250,000 from our joint savings account. It was an oddly specific number. I plugged that amount into the forensic search bar on his email server, scanning for any matching figures in his hidden communications. Within seconds, I found it. A hidden encrypted folder buried deep in his deleted items. It contained a series of frantic, threatening emails from an anonymous external address. The sender had discovered the fabricated lease agreements Jamal used to secure his latest illegal loan. The blackmailer was demanding exactly $250,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency by midnight, or they would forward the concrete proof of the SEC violations directly to Vanguard Equity, effectively killing the $12 million buyout. The reality of the terrace incident hit me with a sickening, violent clarity. Jamal did not just stand by and watch his mother push me because he was a coward. He let it happen because he was out of time. He needed my half of our joint savings to pay off his blackmailer and save the Vanguard deal. But I had refused to sign the financial control over to him earlier that week. So when Vivian's toxic temper flared, Jamal saw a lethal, convenient opportunity to eliminate the only obstacle standing between him and his money. If I died from the fall, or if I was incapacitated in a hospital bed, he would have immediate, uncontested power of attorney over our joint accounts. He tried to sacrifice my life and the life of our unborn child to pay off an extortionist and secure a buyout from a company I secretly owned. Desmond watched my face harden, recognizing the dangerous shift in my demeanor. "If you stay here and fight this as his wife," Desmond said quietly, his legal mind already working through the permutations, "you will be dragged straight into the mud with them. Their creditors will come after your public assets. The SEC investigation will freeze everything attached to your marital name. If you press charges for the assault right now, they will tie you up in family court and criminal proceedings for years, playing the wealthy victims while they bleed you dry." I reached down, resting my hand protectively over my stomach. The baby fluttered softly beneath my palm, a tiny, resilient reminder of exactly what I was fighting for. I could not be Kiara, the scorned wife. The wife was vulnerable. The wife was tied to Jamal through legal contracts and public perception. The wife would have to sit in a courtroom and endure Vivian's lies and Chloe's fake tears. I needed to destroy them from a position of absolute untouchable power. The only person who held their actual lives, their freedom, and their entire legacy in the palm of her hand was the anonymous CEO of Vanguard Equity. I looked at Desmond, my decision solidifying into cold, unyielding iron. To tear their empire down to the studs, to watch them willingly walk into their own destruction, the CEO had to pull the strings from the shadows. And for the CEO to operate freely, the wife had to cease to exist. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my ruined, blood-stained wedding ring, tossing it casually into the nearest trash can. "Get the transport ready, Desmond," I commanded, my voice dropping into the authoritative tone of a woman who commanded billions. "Kiara died on that terrace tonight. It is time for Vanguard to go to work." The pain in my chest was a sharp, unforgiving reminder of gravity. Every shallow breath felt like inhaling shattered glass, but staying in that hospital bed meant waiting for Jamal to finish the job he and his mother had started. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, gritting my teeth as my broken ribs screamed in protest. Desmond stood by the door, his posture rigid with quiet alarm, as I reached for the thick intravenous line taped to the back of my hand. I ripped the medical tape away and pulled the needle out, pressing a cotton swab to the bead of blood that welled up on my skin. The attending physician rushed in seconds later, waving a clipboard and threatening to call hospital security if I did not get back into bed. I did not argue. I simply looked at him, my eyes dead and hollow, and demanded the against medical advice release forms. My hands shook as I signed my name for the very last time as Mrs. Kiara Sterling. I stripped off the pale hospital gown, letting the blood-stained fabric pool on the sterile linoleum floor. I unclasped the heavy diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band Jamal had placed on my finger 3 years ago. I set them directly on top of the ruined gown right next to my crushed cell phone. I was leaving the scared, naive wife in that room. Desmond threw a heavy black wool coat over my shoulders, shielding me from the harsh fluorescent hallway lights, as his private security team formed a protective wall around us. We bypassed the main lobby, entirely utilizing the underground loading dock, where an unmarked black SUV was already idling with the engine running. We drove straight to a private airstrip on the outskirts of Atlanta. I did not look back at the glittering city skyline. I boarded the waiting jet, curling into the plush leather seat and finally allowing myself to touch my stomach. The baby fluttered, a tiny, resilient heartbeat that fueled the cold fire burning inside me. They had tried to extinguish this life, and because of that, my enemies were going to lose absolutely everything. 2 hours later, we touched down in the freezing wind of Chicago. Desmond had secured a multi-level penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, registered under one of Vanguard Equity's heavily guarded subsidiary corporations. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, equipped with biometric locks and a dedicated server room that looked like a military command center. This was where Kiara, the victim, died, and the Vanguard CEO took total control. I spent the first 48 hours ignoring my physical pain and burying myself in digital warfare. With Desmond executing the rapid legal maneuvers, we completely erased my personal footprint. My social media accounts vanished into the ether. My personal banking was routed through impenetrable offshore trusts. My medical records from Atlanta were locked behind ironclad privacy injunctions. To the outside world, and more importantly to Jamal and Vivian, I had simply evaporated into thin air. It did not take long for them to start spinning their twisted narrative. I sat in front of my massive curved monitors, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket, monitoring the digital fallout back in Atlanta. Desmond had installed advanced tracking software on their names, bringing every whisper of their desperate social climbing directly to my screen. The first video popped up on a Sunday morning. It was a live stream from the front steps of Vivian's prestigious sprawling megachurch in Buckhead. Jamal stood in front of the massive stained glass doors wearing a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, looking appropriately haggard. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, while Vivian gripped his arm, playing the role of the tragic, supportive matriarch. Chloe and Malik stood just behind them, bowing their heads in fake, solemn solidarity. Vivian spoke directly to the pastor, her voice artificially amplified by the dozens of phones recording them. She claimed I was a calculating scam artist who had faked an entire pregnancy just to trap her son and steal their wealth. She told the massive congregation that the guilt had finally consumed me, that I had admitted to a fake miscarriage and fled the city in the middle of the night out of pure cowardly shame. Watching Vivian use the church steps as her personal theater of cruelty made my blood boil. It was the exact same tactic she had used during my entire engagement. She would drag me to those lavish Sunday services, sit me in the front pew, and loudly ask the pastor to pray for my modest upbringing so I might eventually learn how to handle the heavy burden of the sterling family wealth. She had constantly weaponized her congregation, isolating me, painting me as a working-class charity case who needed spiritual cleansing just to sit at their mahogany dinner table. Now she was using that exact same holy ground to completely erase the fact that she had tried to violently murder her own grandchild. She smiled mournfully at the camera, asking for prayers for her son, who had been so cruelly deceived by a wicked, manipulative woman. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had discarded me like trash and cleared the path for their massive payday. But they vastly underestimated the level of access I possessed. I opened a secondary terminal on my desk and activated the backdoor I had installed in their smart home security system months ago. The high-definition camera feeds from their Buckhead mansion loaded instantly onto my screen. I switched to the main living room feed, expanding the window to fill my monitor. Jamal and Vivian were not grieving. They were celebrating. Jamal was pouring vintage champagne into crystal flutes, his supposedly heartbroken demeanor completely gone. He laughed loudly, handing a glass to his mother, while Malik and Chloe lounged on the expensive leather chairs. Vivian took a long, victorious sip, sinking back into her custom velvet sofa. She looked around her opulent, unpaid-for mansion with a look of pure, unadulterated greed. She raised her glass toward Jamal. "Now we just get the Vanguard CEO to sign the papers on Friday, and we are completely untouchable," she said, her voice dripping with absolute arrogance. She laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed through the hidden microphone on my screen. "We took out the trash, Jamal, and now we get paid." I stared at the live feed, watching them toast to my supposed demise and their impending financial salvation. A cold, ruthless calm settled deep into my bones. They were practically tasting the $12 million. They thought Friday was their glorious coronation. They thought their SEC fraud was about to be buried forever under a mountain of my corporate cash. I minimized the camera feed and opened my heavily encrypted Vanguard executive email client. The cursor blinked steadily against the stark white background. I addressed the message directly to Jamal's primary corporate inbox, copying Vivian and their entirely useless board of directors. I did not need a long, drawn-out explanation. I did not need to threaten them or list their countless sins. True power required very few words. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and typed a single devastating message. Buyout delayed. Comprehensive financial audit required. I hit send. Less than a second after my finger lifted from the enter key, The heavy silence of the Chicago penthouse was broken by the sharp chime of Jamal's phone, echoing through my monitor speakers. On the surveillance feed, the celebratory atmosphere in the Atlanta mansion froze. Jamal set his crystal champagne flute on the marble coffee table and pulled his phone from his pocket. I watched his posture stiffen. The arrogant smirk that had dominated his face just moments before completely vanished, replaced by an ashen, terrified pallor. He stared at the glowing screen, as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. Vivian noticed the shift immediately. She demanded to know what was wrong, her voice shrill and impatient. When Jamal finally read the brief message aloud, the absolute devastation in the room was palpable. Vivian collapsed back onto the velvet sofa, her hands trembling so violently that her champagne spilled over the rim of her glass, staining the expensive upholstery. The $12 million lifeline they thought they had secured was suddenly miles out of reach, blocked by a wall of intense financial scrutiny they could never survive. Early the next morning, Desmond executed the next phase of our protocol. Acting as the stern, uncompromising legal counsel for Vanguard Equity, he sent a massive, terrifyingly detailed audit mandate to Jamal's corporate office. Vanguard required a top-to-bottom forensic sweep of every single asset liability and offshore holding connected to the Sterling family name. We did not give them a choice in who would conduct this financial autopsy. The mandate explicitly demanded they hire Apex Financial Forensics, a highly specialized, notoriously ruthless auditing firm based out of New York. What Jamal and Vivian did not know and could never discover was that Apex was a shell company entirely owned and operated by Desmond. We controlled the auditors, we controlled the timeline, and we controlled the price. The initial retainer fee to secure Apex was exorbitant, specifically calculated by me to be exactly $20,000 more than the remaining liquid cash Jamal had desperately scraped together. Sitting in my home office overlooking the freezing waters of Lake Michigan, I felt a deep, profound satisfaction watching them scramble. They were bleeding out frantically, trying to find the cash to pay the very people who were going to destroy them. They could not go to a bank. Their credit was completely frozen due to the looming federal investigations. They had to find hard cash, and they had to find it immediately. The smart home security cameras at the mansion gave me a front-row seat to their sheer desperation. Jamal paced the hardwood floors, screaming at his mother that they needed the money by 5 o'clock, or Vanguard would terminate the acquisition entirely. I watched Vivian retreat to her master suite, her face pale and drawn. She walked over to her massive custom-built jewelry safe and pulled out a heavy velvet box. Inside lay her prized possession, a flawless 10-carat diamond tennis bracelet she claimed had been passed down through generations of Sterling matriarchs. In reality, I knew she had bullied Jamal into buying it for her years ago to impress the wives at the Buckhead Country Club. I tracked her movement through the city using the GPS locator. Desmond had quietly slipped into her vehicle history system before we left Atlanta. Vivian did not drive to a bank. She drove to a discreet high-security pawnbroker on the outskirts of the city. She wore massive dark sunglasses and a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her head, terrified of being recognized by anyone from her elite social circles. Her entire existence, her entire sense of superiority was strictly dependent on a fabricated image of untouchable wealth. For years, she had weaponized that fake prestige to humiliate me, to make me feel like a worthless outsider dirtying her pristine world. Now she was standing in a dingy pawn shop, begging a stranger for cash to save her son from federal prison. It was poetic, brutal justice. She secured just enough money to cover the Apex retainer, wiring the funds directly into Desmond's trap. The moment the wire transfer cleared, the hounds were released. Desmond deployed a team of aggressive, relentless forensic accountants to Atlanta. They descended on Jamal's corporate headquarters like a swarm of locusts. From my monitors in Chicago, I watched the digital feed of the audit in real time. The Apex team demanded decades of receipts, unredacted tax returns, and unrestricted access to every digital server in the building. They made Jamal and Malik run in endless, exhausting circles, drowning them in paperwork and generating massive daily billable hours that the family could not possibly afford to pay. The immense crushing pressure of the audit immediately began tearing the family apart. The surveillance cameras in the mansion captured late-night screaming matches. Jamal barked desperate orders at Malik, blaming his younger brother for sloppy accounting. Malik fired back, screaming that Jamal was the one who authorized the fraudulent loans. Vivian tried to mediate, but her nerves were completely frayed, her usual domineering presence replaced by a frantic, weeping mess. And quietly, always hovering in the background of these fights, was Chloe. She stood by the doorways, her sweet, supportive sister-in-law routine, dropping the moment nobody was looking directly at her. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, constantly assessing the sinking ship she had tied herself to. By the end of the first week of the audit, the family was exhausted, paranoid, and completely turning on each other. I was reviewing a newly acquired batch of digital files when Desmond walked into my office. He did not bother knocking. He carried a sleek silver tablet, his expression unreadable, as he placed it gently on my desk. My auditing team just intercepted a heavily encrypted data packet, trying to bypass the company firewalls, Desmond said, his voice low and serious. They broke the encryption 10 minutes ago. Kiara, you need to read this right now. I pulled the tablet toward me. It was a hidden private ledger containing an ongoing email thread. The communication was strictly between Chloe and Malik, using covert servers to hide their messages from Jamal. I scrolled to the top of the thread, my blood turning to absolute ice as I read Chloe's words. The email was sent just hours after they received the Vanguard audit mandate. Chloe wrote with chilling, sociopathic clarity. Vivian did us a massive favor pushing her over that railing, but we are running out of time. Jamal is backed into a corner, and he is going to take the entire $12 million Vanguard buyout for himself to pay off his debts. We will be left with absolutely nothing. We need to frame Jamal for the SEC fraud entirely on our own before Vanguard signs the check. We have to secure our cut before the feds raid the house. I stared at the glowing screen, my hands resting instinctively on my pregnant belly. The sheer depravity of her words echoed in the quiet room. They were not just glad that Vivian had tried to kill me. They had fully endorsed it as a convenient business maneuver. But the immense, crushing weight of my Vanguard trap had successfully broken their fragile loyalty. The Sterling family facade was dead. They were officially eating themselves alive, willing to throw each other to the federal wolves for a scrap of cash. And I was going to let them do exactly that. I sat in the dim glow of my monitors, letting the absolute treachery of the intercepted emails wash over me. The quiet hum of the Chicago penthouse was a sharp contrast to the chaotic war zone I was about to unleash in Atlanta. I rested my hand gently on my stomach, feeling a strong, reassuring kick from my baby. We were safe here, wrapped in luxury and absolute security, while the people who had casually tried to end our lives were trapped in a cage of their own making. I cracked my knuckles and opened my encrypted routing software. It was time to give them exactly what they deserved. I started with Jamal. His offshore debt was a masterpiece of financial stupidity and arrogance. He had leveraged phantom assets to borrow millions from shady shell banks in the Cayman Islands, all to fund his lavish lifestyle and keep Vivian draped in the finest designer clothes. The ledgers proved he was completely underwater, drowning in interest rates he could never hope to pay. I packaged these damning financial records into a clean, anonymous digital file. Using a routed IP address that bounced seamlessly through 3 different countries to mask my location, I dropped the file directly into Malik and Chloe's personal email inboxes. I attached a simple, devastating subject line: "The true cost of your brother." Next, I targeted Vivian. I had intercepted Malik's clumsy attempts to embezzle money from the corporate payroll months ago during my initial forensic sweep of their servers. I gathered his sloppy transfer receipts, his forged vendor invoices, and the pathetic color-coded spreadsheet he used to track his stolen cash. I bypassed the mansion's network security with alarming ease and pushed the entire folder directly onto the home screen of Vivian's personal tablet. I knew her evening routine perfectly. It was a Tuesday night, which meant she was sitting in her massive soaking tub, sipping expensive gin and scrolling through social media to judge her friends. I pulled up the mansion security camera feeds and waited for the explosion. The trap snapped shut within 10 minutes. I watched the high-definition feed from their massive, pristine kitchen. Malik and Chloe were leaning over a laptop on the marble island. The camera captured the exact moment the color completely drained from Chloe's face. She scrolled frantically through Jamal's offshore debt records, her perfectly glossed lips parting in sheer horror. Malik started pacing violently, running his hands over his head in pure panic. The highly sensitive audio feed picked up his heavy, panicked breathing. Jamal is completely underwater, Malik hissed, slamming his fist against the marble countertop. That $12 million buyout from Vanguard will not even cover half of these personal loans. He is going to take the entire Vanguard check and leave us here to face the federal investigators entirely alone. We are going to take the fall for his fraud, Chloe. Chloe looked physically sick. Her eyes darted around the opulent room as her desperate dreams of inherited wealth completely evaporated. She had tolerated this family, played the role of the sweet, supportive white sister-in-law strictly for the payout. Seeing the concrete proof that Jamal was going to leave them with absolutely nothing shattered her fake loyalty in an instant. Before Malik could formulate any kind of coherent plan, a horrific piercing shriek echoed from the second floor of the mansion. Vivian was marching down the grand sweeping staircase, clutching her tablet like a deadly weapon. She was wearing a silk robe, her face flushed red with absolute unrestrained fury. She stormed right into the kitchen and hurled the heavy tablet directly at Malik's chest. It clattered loudly to the floor, displaying his glaring embezzlement ledgers for everyone to see. "You ungrateful, thieving little parasite!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with a rage so intense it distorted the audio feed. Malik backed away immediately, raising his hands in a weak, pathetic defense. He tried to deny it, stammering that the documents were fake, that someone was trying to set him up. But Vivian cut him off with a vicious, stinging slap directly across his face. The sharp sound echoed through the massive kitchen. "Do not you dare lie to me," she roared, stepping into his personal space with terrifying aggression. "I have known you were siphoning money from the payroll accounts for 2 long years." Malik froze, entirely staring at his mother in absolute shock. "You knew," he whispered, his voice trembling. Vivian laughed, a harsh, ugly, terrifying sound. "Of course I knew. Who do you think balanced the ledgers every single month to hide your pathetic theft? Who do you think actively convinced the board of directors that Kiara was the one mismanaging our accounts? I let everyone in this city believe that Southside Trash Bag was bleeding us dry just to protect you. I risked the entire Sterling family name to cover your incredibly sloppy tracks, and this is how you repay me. You plan to frame your own brother and steal my Vanguard money." I stared at my monitors, completely captivated and deeply disgusted by the sheer unadulterated rot of their dynamic. Vivian had willingly framed me for missing funds. She had actively fed the narrative that I was a gold digger, using my working-class background against me to protect her thieving son and preserve their fake, pristine image. Every insult, every condescending remark at family dinners, it was all a calculated smokescreen to hide their own crimes. They had happily sacrificed my reputation and eventually tried to sacrifice my life simply to keep the Sterling name clean. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door banged open. Jamal burst into the foyer, dropping his leather briefcase and sprinting into the kitchen as the screaming match reached a fever pitch. He looked completely exhausted, the relentless pressure of my Vanguard audit clearly taking a severe physical toll on him. He stepped frantically between his mother and his brother, his face a mask of sheer desperate panic. "Shut up, both of you," Jamal yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "If the Vanguard auditors catch a single wind of this infighting, they will pull the plug on the entire deal. We are literally days away from $12 million. We have to keep this family together, or we are all going to spend the rest of our lives in a federal penitentiary." His plea for family unity was a pathetic, empty gesture. The damage was already permanently done. The trust was entirely shattered. I watched Malik push aggressively past his brother, storming out of the kitchen with Vivian screaming vicious obscenities at his back. Jamal sank heavily onto a velvet bar stool, burying his face in his hands. He looked completely broken by the immense pressure of the audit and the sudden violent collapse of his family. He had built his entire life on controlling others, and now he had absolutely zero control. But my eyes shifted away from the broken men and focused on the corner of the screen. Chloe had quietly slipped away during the deafening chaos. I switched the camera feed to the dark, formal dining room. Chloe was sitting completely alone in the shadows, her face illuminated only by the harsh, cold glow of her cell phone. Her expression was devoid of any fear or panic. Instead, her eyes were sharp, calculating, and utterly ruthless. She was typing with frantic, determined speed. She knew the ship was sinking fast, and she had zero intention of going down with the Sterling family. A soft, melodic chime echoed from my computer speakers in the Chicago penthouse. I shifted my attention away from the live video feed and opened my Vanguard executive inbox. An encrypted email had just arrived, marked with the highest possible priority. It was from Chloe. She had bypassed the auditing firm and was contacting the anonymous Vanguard CEO directly. I clicked open the message, a cold smile touching my lips as I read her words. She was offering a desperate, traitorous side deal, fully prepared to sell out her husband, her mother-in-law, and her entire life for a chance at a massive payout. The family had officially eaten itself alive, and I was ready to serve the next course. I clicked open the encrypted message from Chloe. The subject line was completely blank. The body of the email, however, was a masterclass in clinical self-serving betrayal. She introduced herself to the anonymous CEO of Vanguard Equity as a vital insider with the power to guarantee a frictionless acquisition. She claimed to have secured Jamal's original unedited financial ledgers. She was offering the actual books. These were the hidden documents proving he had fabricated 8 figures in commercial real estate assets to secure illegal bank loans. She explicitly pointed out that Vanguard could use these exact ledgers to completely void the $12 million valuation, legally acquiring the Sterling estate for pennies on the dollar, while letting the federal government handle the family's criminal fallout. The price for this silver bullet was $2 million. Chloe demanded the funds be routed to a newly established offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account was registered solely in her maiden name. She was cutting out her husband Malik, her mother-in-law Vivian, and Jamal entirely. I turned my attention to the live surveillance feed from the Atlanta mansion. Chloe was in the master suite she shared with Malik, frantically stuffing designer clothes, expensive shoes, and jewelry into a pair of massive suitcases. Downstairs in the living room, Malik was drowning his panic in a heavy tumbler of scotch, completely unaware that his wife was upstairs, selling his entire family to the highest bidder. Chloe had spent the last 3 years curating a flawless public image as the ultimate progressive ally. She constantly posted photos on social media highlighting her beautiful Black husband and their powerful, wealthy Black family. She wore her marriage like a cultural badge of honor at her charity luncheons, using the Sterling name to elevate her own social standing. But the very second the wealth dried up and the threat of a federal indictment loomed over the house, her performative solidarity vanished. She was ready to throw Malik directly into the line of fire just to ensure she walked away with a heavy purse. Her proximity to Black wealth was only useful to her as long as it paid for her luxury lifestyle. I typed my response from the safety of my Chicago penthouse. Operating as the faceless corporate titan, I completely ignored her desperate pleading tone. I countered her offer with cold mechanical precision. I agreed to the $2 million payout, but I set rigid non-negotiable terms. Digital files were easily manipulated or traced by federal investigators. I demanded the physical hardware. I required the original master flash drive containing the ledgers untouched and uncopied. I gave her exactly 4 hours to deliver the hardware. She was instructed to drive to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, proceed to the South Terminal, and place the drive inside a specific long-term storage locker. I warned her that if she attempted to duplicate the drive or involve law enforcement in any capacity, the deal was completely dead, and Vanguard would immediately forward her extortion attempt directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Chloe replied within 60 seconds. She agreed to every single condition. Desmond was already on the ground in Atlanta managing the aggressive audit through his proxy firm. I sent him the locker coordinates over our secure channel. He mobilized immediately. I tapped into the airport's public security networks, running a facial recognition algorithm to isolate the South Terminal baggage claim area. 2 hours later, Chloe appeared on my monitor. She had attempted to disguise herself wearing a heavy beige trench coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and oversized dark sunglasses. It was a pathetic theatrical attempt at espionage. She practically vibrated with nervous, guilty energy as she approached the bank of metal lockers. She glanced over her shoulder twice, her paranoia blatantly obvious to anyone paying attention, before shoving a small padded envelope into the designated compartment. She slammed the metal door shut, took the physical key, dropped it into a nearby trash receptacle exactly as I had instructed, and rushed blindly out of the terminal. 10 minutes later, Desmond strolled into the frame. He wore a sharp navy suit looking like any other busy traveling executive. He retrieved the key from the trash without breaking his stride, smoothly opened the locker, and slipped the padded envelope into his leather briefcase. The entire physical transfer took less than 15 seconds. He looked directly up at the security camera, giving a microscopic nod, before disappearing into the dense crowd of travelers. I opened my offshore banking portal and wired exactly $10,000 to Chloe's new Cayman account. It was a minuscule, insulting fraction of her $2 million demand, but I tagged the transfer as a good-faith verification deposit. It would keep her waiting, desperate and entirely compliant, while I verified the data. I sat in the silent, dark penthouse watching the freezing rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. 2 hours passed. Desmond was utilizing a highly secure sterile terminal at a private aviation lounge to clone the drive and transmit the encrypted data package directly to my personal server. The progress bar on my monitor finally hit 100%. The transmission was complete. I disconnected my laptop from the main internet network, ensuring absolute isolation, and opened the cloned drive. Chloe had not lied. The master ledgers were all there. I scrolled through thousands of rows of fabricated transactions, fake tenant leases, and illegal loan applications. Jamal had systematically defrauded 3 different private banks and lied directly to federal regulators for years. The documents were a one-way ticket to a maximum security prison for both Jamal and Malik. Vanguard Equity could now legally step in and seize their entire portfolio for the exact cost of their outstanding debt. They were ruined. I prepared to close the application, satisfied that I had the final nail for their coffin. But a secondary hidden partition caught my eye at the very bottom of the directory. It was heavily encrypted, buried under 3 layers of complex password protection that Jamal clearly thought was secure. He was a wealthy, arrogant amateur. I was a forensic accounting expert. I ran a brute-force decryption protocol designed to shatter standard commercial security barriers. The code fractured and broke within 3 minutes. A single isolated folder appeared on my stark black desktop. I leaned forward, my breath catching sharply in my throat as I read the title of the folder. It consisted of a single word: terrace. The heavy reinforced doors of my Chicago penthouse shielded me from the freezing winds ripping across Lake Michigan, but the chill that settled into my bones as I stared at the decrypted folder had nothing to do with the weather. The single word on my monitor seemed to pulse with a dark, mocking energy: terrace. It was just 7 letters, but it carried the agonizing weight of shattered ribs, internal bleeding, and a violent drop that was explicitly meant to end my life. I adjusted my posture in my ergonomic chair, gritting my teeth against the sharp shooting pain in my chest. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. I double-clicked the folder. It did not contain complex financial spreadsheets. It did not contain offshore banking routes or encrypted wire transfer receipts. It contained a massive, unorganized data dump from an Apple iCloud account. Chloe had been incredibly, arrogantly careless. In her frantic, greedy rush to download every single piece of blackmail material she possessed against Jamal and Malik to sell to Vanguard Equity, she had synced her entire personal phone backup to the master flash drive. She had been so blinded by the promise of a $2 million offshore kickback that she had completely forgotten to scrub her personal directories. She handed me the murder weapon wrapped in a neat digital bow. I navigated through thousands of mundane image files. There were pictures of Chloe at exclusive country club luncheons, highly filtered selfies in designer boutiques, and perfectly staged snapshots of expensive meals. Then, buried deep within a subfolder labeled with a random string of dates, I found a standalone high-definition video file. The timestamp read 3:45 in the afternoon. It was recorded exactly 5 hours before the Sterling family dinner began. I clicked play. The video opened to a shaky vertical frame. The camera focused on the intricate stone pillars and heavy wrought iron railing of the St. Regis private dining terrace. The ambient sound of the Atlanta wind rushing across the microphone filled my quiet office, mixed with the distant muffled hum of city traffic below. The camera panned slightly to the right, revealing Malik. My brother-in-law was dressed in dark, uncharacteristically plain clothing, completely abandoning his usual flashy aesthetic. He was kneeling on the polished concrete floor, gripping a heavy industrial steel wrench with both hands. My breath caught hard in my throat. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes tracking his frantic, aggressive movements. Malik was not just inspecting the railing. He was actively dismantling the structural supports. The camera zoomed in the autofocus, adjusting to clearly capture the heavy steel bolts, anchoring the wrought iron barrier to the foundational stone pillars. Malik strained against the wrench, his face contorting with immense physical effort, until a loud, violent metallic crack echoed through the speakers. He had intentionally snapped the primary locking mechanism. He immediately moved to the next bolt, applying the same violent pressure, systematically weakening the entire central section of the safety barrier. It was the exact precise section of the railing where I had been standing when Vivian shoved me backward into the void. Chloe's voice drifted from behind the camera. She was breathing heavily, a sickening mixture of adrenaline and twisted excitement lacing her tone. Her performative sweetness, the fake, dripping Southern charm she used to mask her absolute greed at social events, was completely stripped away. She sounded cold, calculated, and entirely ruthless. "Are you sure that is enough to give way?" Chloe asked, her voice deadly steady. Malik grunted, shifting his body weight to tackle the final anchor bolt. He pulled downward with all his strength. The thick metal groaned and shifted visibly under the pressure, the structural integrity completely and irrevocably compromised. Malik stood up, dropping the heavy wrench onto the concrete and wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes dark, hollow, and devoid of any basic human empathy. "If Mom pushes her buttons tonight," Malik whispered, a sinister, knowing smile stretching across his face, "that railing will not hold a damn thing." The video abruptly cut to black. I sat frozen, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on me like a physical weight. My mind violently rewound the events of that horrific night, mapping this new, terrifying reality over my fragmented memories. Vivian pushing me was not a spontaneous crime of passion. It was the culmination of a meticulously orchestrated lethal trap. Malik and Chloe had intentionally rigged the terrace, transforming a simple architectural feature into a deadly plunging drop. But the most chilling realization was their weapon of choice. They did not push me themselves. They used Vivian. They knew her toxic, narcissistic temper better than anyone in the world. They knew she absolutely could not resist a public confrontation, and they knew she physically lashed out when she felt her authority was challenged. They simply loosened the bolts, set the stage, and let Vivian's predictable, unchecked rage do the dirty work. If I had died on that pavement, Vivian would have taken the fall for manslaughter, permanently removing the overbearing, controlling matriarch from the family hierarchy. Jamal, playing the role of the grieving, devastated widower, would have immediately inherited all my assets. Then, armed with this video and their hoard of financial ledgers, Chloe and Malik planned to extort Jamal for the rest of his life. It was a flawless, sociopathic masterpiece of family destruction. I pushed my chair back from the desk, the room spinning slightly, as the profound depth of their depravity sank into my bones. My entire marriage to Jamal was a calculated predatory setup. I was never a partner to him. I was a mark. They had brought me into their toxic ecosystem because my quiet, reserved demeanor made me an easy scapegoat and my high-level corporate earning potential made me a highly lucrative asset. Every shared holiday dinner, every forced family gathering, every fake smile Chloe had ever flashed in my direction was part of a long-sustained con. Chloe was perhaps the worst of them all. She had spent years weaponizing her performative allyship. She paraded her proximity to a wealthy black family to elevate her own social status, using Malik and the sterling name to secure invitations to elite galas and charity boards. But the very second the generational wealth dried up and the threat of a federal indictment loomed over the mansion, her fake solidarity vanished. She was completely willing to burn her black husband, his mother, and his brother to the ground just to secure her own wealth. Her alliance was strictly transactional. A sharp shooting pain radiated through my healing ribs, pulling me out of my thoughts. I placed my hands flat against my stomach, feeling the firm curve of my belly. The baby moved a sudden strong kick against my palm. The sensation anchored me. It pulled me out of the shock of betrayal and dropped me directly into a state of absolute lethal clarity. They had not just tried to eliminate a convenient scapegoat. They had actively conspired to murder an unborn child just to secure a better position in their fraudulent financial hierarchy. Malik was willing to watch his sister-in-law plummet to her death to clear his debts. Chloe filmed the preparation of my murder as an insurance policy. And Jamal had watched me fall, immediately stepping over my broken, bleeding body to access our joint checking account before the paramedics even arrived. Financial ruin was no longer enough. Draining their bank accounts, stripping them of their country club memberships, and forcing them into a humiliating public bankruptcy was merely a baseline consequence. It was the absolute floor. I looked back at the blank monitor, my hands trembling violently. It was not out of fear. It was a cold, pure, righteous fury. I possessed the master ledgers proving massive multi-million-dollar federal securities fraud. And now, thanks to Chloe's arrogant digital hoarding, I possessed high-definition time-stamped video evidence of a coordinated conspiracy to commit murder. I held the keys to their complete and total annihilation. I did not just have the power to take their mansion, I had the power to take their freedom. I pictured Vivian stripped of her silk robes and diamond bracelets, forced into a harsh canvas uniform. I pictured Jamal, his arrogant smirk permanently erased behind reinforced steel bars. I pictured Chloe and Malik, their web of blackmail entirely useless as federal prosecutors played this exact video for a grand jury. I picked up my secure encrypted smartphone from the desk. I opened my direct communication line to Desmond. He was still on the ground in Atlanta, managing the aggressive audit protocols through our proxy firm and keeping the Sterling family thoroughly distracted by their financial bleeding. I needed him to shift gears immediately. The game board had completely changed. We were no longer just playing for the Vanguard buyout. We were playing for their heads. I typed my message with rapid, forceful keystrokes, the plan already fully formed and executing in my mind. The Vanguard CEO was about to make a personal appearance, and Kiara, the victim, was about to return from the dead. I hit send. Prepare the final acquisition contracts. We are going back to Atlanta. Desmond did not ask a single question when my text message illuminated his screen. My corporate attorney simply replied with a rigid acknowledgement, immediately setting the wheels in motion for our return to the city that had tried to bury me. I closed the encrypted folder containing the damning video of Malik and Chloe sabotaging the terrace railing and leaned back in my chair. The cold Chicago wind battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, but the temperature inside my chest was absolute zero. The game was no longer about simple financial ruin. It was about total, inescapable annihilation. While Desmond finalized the lethal legal traps we were going to spring, I turned my attention back to the massive curved monitors dominating my desk. Jamal and Vivian were entirely oblivious to the federal guillotine hanging directly over their heads. In their delusional minds, they had survived the Vanguard equity audit. They believed they had successfully hidden their massive SEC violations, buried Malik's pathetic embezzlement, and permanently eliminated me from the equation. To celebrate their imaginary victory, Vivian was throwing a massive, opulent gathering she had dubbed the New Beginnings Gala. I did not need a physical invitation to attend. I had unrestricted access to the digital world. I pulled up half a dozen social media live streams broadcasted by Atlanta's most desperate social climbers, projecting the gala across my screens. Vivian had rented out the grand ballroom of the most exclusive country club in Buckhead. The room was dripping in white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and an obnoxious excess of gold accents. Waiters in immaculate white tuxedo jackets circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne and caviar. It looked like the ultimate display of generational wealth and untouchable power. But I possessed their master financial ledgers, and I knew the pathetic, humiliating truth behind every single flower arrangement. I opened a secondary window and cross-referenced the country club's vendor invoices with Vivian's personal banking records. The contrast between the glittering video feed and the stark red numbers on my screen was entirely pathetic. Vivian had maxed out 4 separate high-interest credit cards just to secure the ballroom deposit and the catering staff. She was currently drowning in a sea of revolving consumer debt, paying astronomical interest rates just to project an image of financial supremacy to people who would gladly watch her choke. On the center monitor, a live feed zoomed in on Vivian holding court near the ice sculpture. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown that sparkled under the heavy ballroom lights. She looked like a queen surveying her loyal subjects. I ran a quick forensic search on the designer label, accessing the transactional history of her recent purchases. There was no purchase record. Instead, I found a digital receipt from a high-end luxury rental boutique based out of Manhattan. The supposed matriarch of the Sterling Empire, the woman who had mercilessly mocked my working-class background and criticized my sensible shoes, was parading around in a rented dress secured by a credit card that was exactly $300 away from its maximum limit. Her entire existence was a fragile hollow shell constructed from lies and desperate ego. I unmuted the audio on a live stream being recorded by one of Vivian's closest country club frenemies. Vivian was laughing loudly, her signature grating cackle cutting through the ambient string quartet music. She leaned in close to her circle of diamond-draped friends, her voice dripping with artificial relief and vicious satisfaction. "The family business is stronger than it has ever been," Vivian bragged, swirling her champagne. "We had to navigate a few unfortunate hurdles recently, of course. Jamal has such a big heart, he simply trusts the wrong people. But we finally took out the trash. The Sterling name is completely cleansed." My jaw locked tightly as I listened to her gloat. She was standing in a rented dress, drinking unpaid-for champagne, openly celebrating my supposed disappearance. She was proudly taking credit for throwing me away like garbage, completely confident that the terrace incident had secured their $12 million payday. She believed she had orchestrated the perfect murder, silencing the working-class wife and securing her elite status forever. The sheer sociopathic audacity of her fake triumph fueled the dark, unyielding fire burning in my veins. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling the steady, reassuring kick of my baby. They had tried to kill us for this fake rented life. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. A hush fell over the grand ballroom as Jamal stepped up to the main microphone, positioned in front of a towering wall of white roses. He was the perfect picture of a grieving but resilient aristocratic son. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, his hair perfectly lined, his expression fixed into a mask of solemn gratitude. He tapped his crystal flute with a silver spoon, waiting for the room to give him their absolute undivided attention. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate this new chapter for the Sterling family." Jamal began, his voice projecting smoothly through the ballroom speakers. "We have weathered some incredibly difficult storms over the past few weeks. We have faced personal tragedies and heartbreaking betrayals from people we brought into our inner circle." The hypocrisy of his words was physically nauseating. He was standing on a stage playing the victim while secretly drowning in offshore debt and actively hiding a massive federal fraud scheme. I scanned the background of the stage, my eyes moving past Jamal to the family standing directly behind him. Malik stood on the far left looking physically ill. His skin was pale and a heavy sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He knew exactly what was waiting for him. He knew Vivian had discovered his clumsy corporate embezzlement, and he knew Jamal was planning to take the entire Vanguard buyout to cover his own illegal loans. Malik was trapped on that stage, forcing a smile while internally panicking about his impending federal indictment. But Chloe was the true masterpiece of the frame. She stood slightly behind Jamal, wearing a breathtaking scarlet dress that hugged her frame perfectly. To the guests in the ballroom, she looked like the epitome of supportive family loyalty. She maintained a soft, encouraging smile, nodding along to Jamal's hypocritical speech about unity and resilience. I zoomed the camera feed directly onto Chloe's hands. She was holding a glittering gold clutch in front of her waist, but her fingers were discreetly wrapped around her smartphone, keeping the screen hidden from the crowd. I checked the network traffic bouncing off the country club's public router. Chloe was not listening to a single word her brother-in-law was saying. She was frantically refreshing her offshore Cayman Islands banking application every 30 seconds. She was standing on that stage surrounded by the family she had just sold out, waiting for the $2 million kickback I had promised her. Her performative solidarity was entirely dead. She was just waiting for the deposit to clear so she could vanish into the night and leave her black husband to take the fall for everything. I picked up my secure phone and typed a single command to Desmond: execute. On the live stream, Jamal raised his glass high into the air. To family loyalty, Jamal declared loudly. To standing together when the world tries to tear you apart. To the sterling legacy. Before the crowd could raise their glasses in response, a sharp, piercing ringtone echoed from Jamal's tuxedo pocket. He froze, his grand toast interrupted. He looked annoyed, preparing to silence the call, until he pulled the phone out and checked the caller ID. I watched his entire body jolt. The arrogant, composed host vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified, desperate sycophant. He saw the Vanguard equity proxy number flashing on his screen. "Excuse me," Jamal stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly. "This is an incredibly important business call." He stepped down from the stage, practically sprinting toward a quiet alcove near the kitchen doors. I tapped a few keys on my laptop, patching directly into the audio feed of the phone call. Desmond's voice came through my speakers, deep, authoritative, and completely stripped of any human warmth. He was operating flawlessly as the Vanguard executive proxy. "Mr. Sterling," Desmond said smoothly, "I am calling to inform you that the Vanguard audit protocols have concluded. The CEO has reviewed your ledgers and is highly intrigued by the structure of your portfolio." I could hear Jamal's ragged, frantic breathing through the phone. "Yes, absolutely." Jamal gasped, his voice trembling with sheer relief. "We are ready to proceed immediately. Tell the CEO we are completely ready. The CEO has decided to finalize this acquisition personally." Desmond continued, ignoring Jamal's desperate tone. "The $12 million buyout will be executed tomorrow morning. The CEO is flying into Atlanta tonight. You are instructed to bring the final contracts to the executive boardroom at the St. Regis Hotel tomorrow at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Do not be late." The St. Regis, the exact same hotel where Vivian had pushed me over the terrace railing. The poetry of the location was absolute lethal perfection. Jamal did not even register the irony. He was completely blinded by the promise of the money. "Yes, the St. Regis," Jamal confirmed frantically. 9 o'clock. We will be there. Thank the CEO for me. Thank them for everything." Desmond disconnected the line. Jamal stood in the alcove for 3 seconds, clutching his phone to his chest, his eyes squeezed shut in pure, unadulterated ecstasy. He believed he had won. He believed his fraudulent loans were handled, his SEC investigation was dead, and his wealth was secured. He turned around and sprinted back into the grand ballroom, ignoring the microphone entirely. "We got it!" Jamal screamed, grabbing Vivian by the shoulders and shaking her. "Vanguard is signing the check tomorrow morning. We are rich." The ballroom erupted into cheers and applause. Vivian threw her arms around Jamal's neck, weeping tears of genuine, greedy joy. The rented dress shimmered under the chandeliers as they danced in a circle, celebrating their flawless victory. I sat in my quiet, dark penthouse, watching them celebrate their own impending doom. Jamal had just loudly and publicly invited his own executioner to the table. I shut my laptop, the glow of the screens fading to black. It was time to go home. I rested my hand on my swollen belly, feeling the rhythmic, forceful kicks of my child against the fine silk of my tailored maternity suit. The deep hum of the private jet's engines vibrating through the leather seat was a comforting, steady bass line to the symphony of destruction I was about to conduct. Outside the reinforced window, the frozen sprawl of Chicago gave way to the endless blanket of clouds as we climbed to cruising altitude, charting a direct course for Atlanta. I stared at my reflection in the thick glass, tracing the sharp, uncompromising lines of my own face. The woman looking back at me was a complete stranger to the Sterling family. 6 months ago, I was the quiet, accommodating black wife who shrank herself to fit into their suffocating elitist mold. I had worn the sensible shoes, bitten my tongue during Vivian's passive-aggressive microaggressions, and poured my exceptional earning potential into a joint account Jamal treated as his personal slush fund. I had been the perfect obedient scapegoat. Now I was a corporate titan, heavily, beautifully pregnant, backed by an untouchable legal and financial arsenal, and operating as the phantom CEO of Vanguard Equity. My transformation from a people-pleasing casualty to a ruthless executioner was absolute. Desmond sat across from me at the polished walnut cabin table, seamlessly swiping through a tablet filled with real-time surveillance feeds and acquisition contracts. He wore a charcoal suit, looking entirely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of the trap we were flying into. "The Sterling family has arrived at the St. Regis." Desmond reported, his voice crisp and clinical over the ambient noise of the cabin. They booked the executive boardroom under Vivian's name, using a high-yield credit card that our algorithms flagged as 99% maxed out. They have ordered 3 bottles of vintage champagne to the room, celebrating early. I let out a low, dark laugh that contained absolutely zero humor. Let them drink. It is the last taste of luxury they will have before the federal indictments freeze every liquid asset tied to their names. "The acquisition paperwork is finalized." Desmond continued, tapping a thick leather portfolio resting between us. "The clauses are ironclad. The moment Jamal signs the primary transfer agreement, he legally admits to the fraudulent property valuations, transferring full liability away from Vanguard and cementing his own SEC violations. Chloe's offshore transfer is queued and waiting for my manual override. Malik's embezzlement files are prepped for auto-delivery to the FBI Cyber Division. And the terrorist video I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Loaded on a secure tablet, ready for playback at your discretion. I nodded, turning my attention back to the window. The St. Regis. The poetic justice of signing their financial and literal death warrants in the exact same building where they had plotted to end my life was a masterpiece I had curated for half a year. I remembered the sensation of the cold Atlanta wind on my skin, the terrifying sound of the metal railing snapping under Vivian's violent shove, and the agonizing bone-crushing impact of the pavement below. I had survived by a miracle, pulled from the brink of death, by an anonymous emergency room protocol, while they went back to their mansion to drink scotch and count my assets. I closed my eyes, letting the memory harden into pure, weaponized focus. Today, I was bringing the pavement to them. 600 miles away, the atmosphere inside the St. Regis executive boardroom was thick with suffocating arrogance and desperate vibrating panic. The live security feed Desmond had patched into my monitor displayed the Sterling family in all their pathetic, hollow glory. The room was a monument to corporate luxury, featuring a massive mahogany conference table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Buckhead skyline, and plush leather seating designed for billionaires. Vivian paced near the head of the table, clutching a crystal flute of champagne. She had spared absolutely no expense for her final triumphant performance. She wore a tailored crimson pantsuit that screamed old money, her neck draped in heavy, ostentatious diamonds. She was playing the role of the conquering matriarch, blissfully unaware that her entire empire was built on stolen sand. I want everyone sharp today, Vivian commanded, her voice sharp and echoing across the sterile boardroom. This Vanguard CEO is a ghost. We know nothing about his preferences, his background, or his investment strategy, but we know he is bringing a $12 million check. We smile, we sign the papers, and we secure this family's legacy for the next century. Jamal sat near the center of the table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. He looked arrogant, relaxed, and deeply relieved. The heavy dark circles that had plagued his eyes during the forensic audit were completely gone. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his champagne. "The audit is closed, Mom," Jamal said smoothly, projecting a fake, nauseating confidence. "Vanguard cleared our ledgers. The CEO is flying down personally because he knows the sterling portfolio is the crown jewel of the Atlanta real estate market. We survived the storm. We took out the trash, and now we reap the rewards." Malik stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, keeping a safe physical distance from his mother and brother. His performance was significantly less convincing. His hands trembled slightly as he held his glass, his eyes constantly darting toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. He was sweating through his expensive silk shirt. He knew Vivian possessed the ledgers proving his massive corporate embezzlement. He knew Jamal was planning to leave him drowning in federal debt. He was a cornered rat desperately hoping the Vanguard buyout would somehow magically reset the family dynamic before he was thrown to the wolves. "Just sign the papers," Jamal Malik muttered, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. "Do not negotiate. Do not play hardball. Take the $12 million and close the deal." "I know how to handle a corporate buyout," Malik Jamal snapped back viciously. "Try not to sweat on the legal documents. You look like a liability." Standing quietly in the corner of the room, Chloe watched the infighting with absolute silent contempt. She wore a sleek, minimalist black dress, looking every bit the supportive, dutiful wife of a wealthy executive. But her eyes were dead-focused entirely on the glowing screen of her smartphone, hidden in the palm of her hand. She was refreshing her Cayman Islands banking app, waiting for the $2 million kickback she had secured by selling out the 3 people currently arguing in the room. She did not care if Jamal went to prison. She did not care if Vivian lost the mansion. She certainly did not care if Malik took the fall for the embezzlement. She was simply waiting for the transfer alert to flash across her screen so she could walk out of the St. Regis, hail a cab to the airport, and vanish into a life of tropical luxury. They were a family of venomous snakes trapped in a glass box, actively preparing to strike each other the second the money hit the table. The private jet touched down on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport with a smooth, decisive thud. I stepped out of the cabin into the humid Atlanta air, my tailored maternity coat shielding me from the morning chill. A sleek, armored black SUV was idling on the runway, completely bypassing the public terminals. Desmond opened the heavy door for me, his face a mask of strict professional execution. The drive to Buckhead was a blur of familiar, haunting landmarks. We navigated through the heavy morning traffic, pulling up to the grand, imposing entrance of the St. Regis. The valet rushed forward to open the door, but Desmond intercepted him, guiding me directly through the opulent, marble-floored lobby. We bypassed the reception desk, entirely heading straight for the private executive elevators. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished stones, sounding like a ticking clock counting down to total devastation. I felt the baby shift again, a strong, reassuring pressure. We were doing this. We were ending the nightmare. The elevator doors slid open on the penthouse executive level. The corridor was hushed, lined with thick sound-absorbing carpets and modern, abstract art. 2 massive, heavy oak doors stood at the end of the hallway, marking the entrance to the primary boardroom. I stopped 10 feet away from the doors. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy, calculated fury settle into my chest. I smoothed the lapels of my suit. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 9 o'clock. "Showtime," Desmond murmured, stepping forward to grip the brass handles of the double doors. Inside the boardroom, the tension was reaching a fever pitch. The live audio feed in Desmond's earpiece confirmed they were silently watching the clock. "He is here," Vivian whispered urgently inside the room. "Positions. Everyone look sharp." Desmond pushed the heavy oak doors open with a smooth, dramatic thrust. The doors swung wide, revealing the sprawling, sunlit boardroom. Vivian, Jamal, Malik, and Chloe immediately snapped to attention. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind the massive mahogany table, their faces instantly stretching into their best, most sycophantic, polished corporate smiles. They were beaming, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, eager to welcome the faceless billionaire CEO who held the $12 million key to their salvation. They stared directly at the doorway, their fake smiles frozen in place, as I stepped over the threshold and walked into the light. The blinding morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the edge of my tailored silhouette as I crossed the threshold. For one suspended, agonizing second, the room remained entirely frozen. The sycophantic smiles plastered across their faces held firm, their brains completely unable to process the visual information their eyes were transmitting. They were expecting an anonymous, silver-haired corporate savior. Instead, a ghost had just walked into the room. The transition from eager anticipation to sheer, unadulterated horror was a masterpiece I will replay in my mind for the rest of my life. Vivian was the first to physically react. The flawless, manufactured poise she had cultivated for decades instantly shattered. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished mahogany floor with a sharp, violent crack, sending shards of glass and expensive vintage champagne splashing violently against the hem of her rented emerald gown. She did not flinch. She did not even look down. Her mouth hung open, her perfectly manicured hands trembling at her sides as she stared at my heavily pregnant form. Behind me, Desmond stepped into the room, his presence cold and immovable. He was immediately followed by a phalanx of 4 unsmiling corporate attorneys carrying heavy leather briefcases. They moved with military precision, fanning out along the back wall of the boardroom. The last lawyer through the entrance turned and firmly pushed the heavy oak door shut. The loud, definitive click of the brass deadbolt locking into place echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. They were completely trapped. Jamal physically recoiled. All the fake arrogant confidence he had displayed on the stage the night before evaporated instantly. He stumbled backward, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping on the spilled champagne, until his spine collided hard against the edge of the massive conference table. He gripped the mahogany wood with white knuckles, his chest heaving as if the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. His eyes darted wildly from my face down to the undeniable prominent curve of my belly and back up again. His mind was short-circuiting, desperately trying to reconcile the broken, bleeding woman he had left for dead on the pavement with the radiant, untouchable powerhouse standing before him. Kiara Jamal stammered, his voice weak, high-pitched and completely devoid of authority. You are alive. You are pregnant. What are you doing here? I did not give him the courtesy of a verbal response. Words were entirely unnecessary when my mere presence was currently suffocating them. I kept my expression completely blank, channeling the cold, calculating energy I had spent the last 6 months perfecting. I walked slowly into the center of the room. My heels struck the floor in a steady, measured rhythm, parting the sea of their panic. As I moved past Malik, I caught the exact moment his soul left his body. He was staring at Desmond, recognizing the voice of the executive proxy from the phone call the night before, and then looking back at me. He backed away, pressing his shoulders flat against the glass window, looking as though he wanted to physically phase through the pain and plummet to the street below, rather than face the reckoning I had brought to his doorstep. Chloe was completely paralyzed. The scarlet dress she wore seemed to drain the color directly from her face, leaving her a pale, terrified shell. Her hands were still tightly gripping her smartphone. I knew exactly the horrific realization crashing through her mind. She had just spent the last 12 hours communicating with the Vanguard Equity CEO, negotiating a $2 million extortion payout, and submitting a video of an attempted murder. Looking at me, flanked by the Vanguard legal team, the math finally clicked into place in her greedy, opportunistic brain. She had handed her own confession directly to her intended victim. She closed her eyes, a silent sob racking her chest. I approached the head of the conference table. The heavy, high-backed leather chair designated for the billionaire buyer sat empty, waiting for me. The sound of my approach finally snapped Vivian out of her catatonic shock. Her survival instinct, honed by decades of ruthless social climbing and financial manipulation, desperately tried to assert control over a situation she had already entirely lost. She lunged forward, stepping into my path with a wild, cornered look in her eyes. The mask of the refined, wealthy matriarch burned away, revealing the vicious, toxic bully underneath. "How did you get past security?" Vivian shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing harshly against the glass walls. "I do not know what kind of pathetic, desperate scam you are trying to pull by showing up here today, but this is a private corporate booking. We are in the middle of closing a multi-million-dollar acquisition with Vanguard Equity. You do not belong here. Get out of this room right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." Her command was a pathetic, empty echo of the authority she used to wield over me in her sprawling kitchen. 6 months ago, a tone like that would have made me shrink, apologize, and quietly exit through the back door. Today, I did not even break my stride. I looked at her the way one looks at a speck of dirt on a pristine floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply stopped walking and stared her down until she physically withered under my gaze. The absolute silence stretched on thick and suffocating, forcing Vivian to realize that her words carried absolutely zero weight in this room. Desmond stepped smoothly around Vivian as if she were completely invisible. He moved to the head of the table, placing his leather portfolio down with a heavy thud, and deliberately pulled out the massive CEO chair. He did not look at my mother-in-law. He did not acknowledge her frantic, desperate screaming. He treated her like a ghost. "If you please, Madam CEO Desmond," said his voice ringing with absolute deferential respect. He reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a solid, heavy gold fountain pen. He held it out to me, offering the instrument of their financial execution with both hands. The sight of the gold pen passing from the executive proxy into my hands finally broke the last remaining shred of Vivian's reality. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat as she choked on her own breath. The illusion she had spent her entire life protecting, the generational wealth, the untouchable status, the absolute control over her family, had just been completely dismantled by the very woman she had tried to casually discard. She sank into a nearby chair, her eyes wide and completely vacant. I took the pen from Desmond. The cool, heavy metal felt perfect against my skin. I turned smoothly and lowered myself into the leather chair at the head of the table, the position of absolute authority. I adjusted my posture, leaning back comfortably and resting my hands gently over the curve of my pregnant belly. I felt a surge of maternal pride, a fierce protective instinct that validated every agonizing hour of the last 6 months. We had won. I looked down the length of the long mahogany table. Jamal was still pressed against the edge, his chest heaving, his eyes begging for a reality that no longer existed. Malik was silently weeping against the glass. Chloe was staring at the floor, completely broken, and Vivian was completely silent, destroyed by her own hubris. I let them drown in the silence for 10 more seconds, savoring the absolute destruction of the Sterling family empire. Then I finally spoke. My voice was smooth, cold, and entirely absolute. "I am here to sign the papers, Jamal. I am Vanguard Equity." The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavy enough to crack the foundation of the building. I watched the realization physically strike each of them, a brutal, invisible blow that drained every ounce of color from their faces. The arrogant, untouchable Sterling family was suddenly reduced to a collection of pale, trembling statues. Jamal's mouth opened and closed silently, his vocal cords completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the situation. Vivian remained slumped in her chair, her eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at me as if a demon had just crawled out of the floorboards to drag her to hell. Malik broke first. The crushing weight of the trap shattered his fragile, embezzling nerves. He spun away from the window, his expensive leather shoes scrambling for traction on the polished floor. He abandoned his mother, ignored his brother, and sprinted directly for the heavy oak doors. He grabbed the brass handle, jerking it downward with frantic, animalistic desperation. The deadbolt held firm. The loud metallic rattle of the locked door echoed pitifully through the cavernous boardroom. He threw his shoulder against the solid wood, a pathetic, high-pitched whimper escaping his throat. Desmond did not even blink. He simply raised a single finger. Two towering security contractors who had been standing flush against the back wall stepped forward. They moved with terrifying silent efficiency. One of them clamped a massive hand onto Malik's shoulder, effortlessly peeling him off the door and shoving him backward. Malik stumbled, his knees buckling, until he collapsed into a leather guest chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The physical escape route was entirely sealed. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. I sat at the head of the table watching their collective breakdown with absolute glacial serenity. I folded my hands, resting them gently over the curve of my pregnant belly. The child inside me shifted, a quiet, powerful reminder of exactly what was at stake and exactly why these people needed to be completely eradicated from society. I broke the silence. My voice was pitched perfectly low, forcing them to lean in, forcing them to hang on my every word. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a thick, heavy red folder. I placed it flat on the mahogany surface and pushed it smoothly down the center of the table. It slid with a satisfying hiss, coming to a stop directly in front of Jamal. He stared at the bright crimson cardstock, as if it were an active explosive device. "Before we discuss your $12 million Vanguard acquisition," I said, my tone carrying the clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel, "let us talk about the railing." I did not wait for a response. I picked up a small remote control from the table and pressed a single button. The lighting in the boardroom instantly dimmed. A massive high-definition projector screen descended from the ceiling behind me. It flared to life, illuminating the dark room with the shaky vertical footage I had pulled from Chloe's careless iCloud backup. The ambient sound of the Atlanta wind rushing across a microphone filled the silent boardroom. On the screen, Malik appeared kneeling on the St. Regis dining terrace. He was gripping a heavy industrial steel wrench. The sharp, violent metallic crack of the anchoring bolts snapping echoed off the boardroom walls, sounding 10 times louder in the enclosed space. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her eyes darted from the screen to Malik, who was now curled into a fetal position in his chair, rocking back and forth. Jamal stood entirely frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He was not horrified that his family had attempted to murder me. He was horrified that they had left a digital paper trail that was currently torching his corporate buyout. Then Chloe's voice drifted from the boardroom speakers, asking Malik if the railing was loose enough to give way. The video concluded with Malik looking directly into the lens, his sinister smile stretching across his face. "If Mom pushes her buttons tonight," Malik whispered through the speakers, "that railing will not hold a damn thing." The video cut to black. I tapped the remote, bringing the harsh fluorescent lights back up to full capacity. The silence was completely deafening. I looked directly at Vivian. The matriarch, who had spent the last 6 months bragging about taking out the trash, was now hyperventilating. She finally understood the full scope of the conspiracy. She understood that her beloved son and her flawless daughter-in-law had actively planned to use her toxic, uncontrollable temper as a murder weapon. They had engineered a scenario where she would be the one to push me, ensuring she would take the criminal fall for manslaughter, while they collected the insurance money. Her own children had weaponized her narcissism to destroy her. "No!" Chloe shrieked, the sound tearing through the room like shattered glass. Chloe lunged forward, her hands slamming flat against the mahogany table. The performative, supportive wife act completely evaporated. Her survival instinct overrode any lingering shred of marital loyalty. She pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at her husband, who was still cowering in the guest chair. "It was all him!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with desperate, hysterical tears. "He forced me to film it. He told me if I did not help him, he would cut me off and leave me with nothing. I was terrified of him. I only kept the video because I was planning to go to the police. I am a victim here. You have to believe me, Kiara. He is a monster." Malik snapped his head up, staring at his wife in absolute bewildered horror. He had spent years funding her luxury lifestyle, covering her exorbitant credit card bills, and playing the role of the devoted partner. In less than 30 seconds, she had completely severed his throat to save herself. Her loyalty was entirely conditional on the money, and the second the money vanished, so did her marriage vows. You lying parasite! Malik spat, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and rage. You came up with the plan. You said we needed her out of the way before the Vanguard auditors looked at the personal accounts. Shut up! Chloe roared back. Her face flushed red, completely abandoning her curated southern charm. You incompetent, embezzling failure. You ruined this family, and I am not going to prison for your sloppy mistakes. I watched them tear each other to pieces, a pack of starving wolves fighting over a poisoned carcass. They were exactly who I always knew they were. I did not raise my voice to interrupt them. I simply let them exhaust their pathetic, treacherous energy until the silence crept back into the room. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, locking my gaze directly onto Chloe's desperate, tear-stained face. I smiled. It was a cold, absolute, merciless smile. I already forwarded the unedited video file to the Atlanta Police Department, I stated calmly. The lead detective on my original accident report received the footage along with a comprehensive forensic breakdown of the metadata at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Chloe physically staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth. Jamal closed his eyes, slumping into his chair as the reality of a federal indictment washed over him. But I am not finished. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe. Let us talk about the $2 million kickback you tried to extort from me last night. You assumed you were communicating with a faceless corporate entity. You demanded the funds be routed to a newly established offshore account in the Cayman Islands. You specifically registered that account in your maiden name to hide the assets from your husband and the federal government. Chloe was shaking so violently she had to grip the back of her chair to remain standing. How do you know that she whispered, her voice completely devoid of air? Because I authorized the wire transfer. I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal, deadly whisper. But I did not route the funds from Vanguard Equity. I routed the $10,000 verification deposit through an account strictly monitored and controlled by the Internal Revenue Service. When you signed the digital receipt to accept those offshore funds this morning, you officially documented an unregistered foreign asset. You just confessed to federal tax evasion in writing. Chloe collapsed into her chair, her entire body going limp as her luxury world completely disintegrated. She had tried to sell her family for a golden parachute, and she had jumped straight into a federal snare. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the distant sound of sirens began to wail. The high-pitched, urgent noise cut through the thick glass, echoing across the Buckhead skyline. The sound grew steadily louder, multiplying as multiple squad cars converged on the St. Regis Hotel. I leaned back in the CEO chair, watching the blood drain from their faces as they realized the police were not coming to take their statements. They were coming to take their freedom. The piercing wail of the police sirens outside the St. Regis multiplied, echoing off the surrounding glass skyscrapers and vibrating through the thick windows of the executive boardroom. The sound acted like a physical shockwave. The paralyzed silence that had gripped the Sterling family shattered instantly. Survival instincts sharpened by decades of corporate backstabbing and familial treachery violently hijacked their brains. Jamal was the first to pivot. The arrogant, composed executive vanished entirely, replaced by a cornered animal desperate to chew off its own leg to escape a trap. He spun away from the conference table, his eyes wide and manic, and launched himself directly at his older brother. "You stupid, arrogant fool!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with unhinged terror. He grabbed Malik by the lapels of his expensive silk shirt and slammed him backward. Malik hit the reinforced glass window with a heavy, sickening thud. The impact rattled the pane, but Jamal did not let go. He shook his brother violently, spit flying from his lips as he aggressively constructed his alibi in real time. "You tried to kill my wife," Jamal roared, projecting his voice loudly enough to ensure Desmond and the Vanguard legal team heard every single syllable. "You tried to murder the mother of my child for a payout. You are a psychopath, Malik. You ruined this family. I will testify against you myself. I will watch them lock you away for the rest of your pathetic life." Malik did not fight back. He simply hung limp in Jamal's grip, his eyes completely vacant, silently weeping as his brother used him as a human shield against federal prison. Jamal shoved Malik away in disgust, letting him crumple to the mahogany floor in a pathetic heap. Then Jamal performed the most grotesque psychological pivot I had ever witnessed. He turned his back on his brother, smoothed the wrinkled lapels of his custom Italian suit, and took a deep, ragged breath. He transformed his expression from violent rage into a mask of pure, desperate devotion. He took a slow, tentative step toward the head of the table. Desmond immediately shifted his weight, his hand dropping toward his waist, but I raised a single finger to call him off. I wanted Jamal to approach. I wanted to look directly into his eyes while I dismantled his entire existence. Kiara, Jamal whispered. He used the soft, intimate tone he used to deploy whenever he needed me to co-sign a fraudulent loan or overlook a suspicious bank transfer. He walked toward my chair, his hands raised in a gesture of complete surrender. Kiara, baby, look at me. Please. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my pregnant stomach. My face was a mask of carved stone. I did not know Jamal pleaded, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I swear to you on my life I had absolutely no idea they were planning something so evil. You know I would never let anyone hurt you. My mother and my brother, they manipulated both of us. They kept me in the dark because they knew I would protect you. He took another step, his eyes dropping to my belly. A tear actually breached his lower lash line, a masterclass in sociopathic acting. We can still fix this, Kiara, Jamal begged, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. We can walk out of this room together. We can leave them to the police. We can take the Vanguard money and start over. Just you and me, for our child. Do not throw our family away because of their sins. We can survive this. He reached his hand out, attempting to gently cover my hands where they rested on our child. Do not touch me, I said. My voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was an absolute freezing void. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jamal froze his hand, hovering 3 inches from my stomach, physically repelled by the sheer, unadulterated disgust radiating from my body. I turned my head slightly, breaking eye contact with him to look at Desmond. Desmond stepped forward, smoothly opening the thick leather portfolio he had placed on the table. He retrieved a heavy manila envelope sealed with a red string tie and handed it to me. I looked back at the man who had promised to cherish me while quietly siphoning my life savings into offshore dummy corporations. I tossed the manila envelope directly at his chest. It hit his silk tie with a sharp smack before dropping onto the polished mahogany table, sliding a few inches toward him. Jamal stared down at the thick envelope, his chest heaving, absolutely terrified to touch it. Divorce papers, Jamal. I stated, my words ringing with lethal clarity. They are already filed with the state. The asset division is completely non-negotiable, but that is the least of your concerns today. The second document in that envelope is a courtesy copy from my contacts at the Department of Justice. It is your federal indictment. Jamal's jaw slackened. His eyes darted from the envelope to my face. Indictment, he breathed the word barely escaping his lips. Securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. I listed, checking them off on my fingers. You honestly believed Vanguard Equity missed your offshore accounts during the audit protocol. You believed your amateur hour property valuations actually fooled a multi-billion-dollar acquisition firm. We did not clear your ledgers, Jamal. We seized them. We audited every single fraudulent shell company you built to hide your massive debts. No! Jamal stammers, shaking his head frantically, grasping the edge of the table to keep his knees from buckling. No, that is impossible. The master ledgers are encrypted. They are air-gapped. You could never access the root files without physical authorization. You are entirely correct, I agreed, offering him a cold, razor-sharp smile. I could not access them remotely, which is why your lovely sister-in-law was kind enough to sell your unredacted fraudulent ledgers to me for a steep discount. The silence that followed was absolute perfection. Jamal slowly, mechanically turned his head to look down the length of the conference table. Chloe was still slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands, completely destroyed by her own failed tax evasion scheme. At the sound of my revelation, she slowly lowered her hands. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black streams. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with sheer terror. I promised Chloe a $2 million golden parachute to walk away from this family, I explained, keeping my tone light and conversational. All she had to do was slip a cloned flash drive into your home office safe and copy your encrypted master files while you were sleeping. She handed me your entire criminal history on a silver platter just so she could abandon you and move to the Cayman Islands. You rat, Jamal screamed. The charming, manipulative husband vanished entirely. The slick, aristocratic corporate executive evaporated into thin air. As Jamal stared at his wife, who had just sold him into federal prison, the heavy, imposing facade he had worn his entire life completely crumbled. Jamal Sterling was never a self-made man. He was a hollow, empty suit propped up by stolen money and fiercely protected by his mother's aggressive, toxic maneuvering. Without his fraudulent wealth and without his ability to manipulate the women around him, he was absolutely nothing. He was just a terrified, incompetent little boy, realizing that the adults in the room were finally holding him accountable. He spun away from Chloe and looked wildly at his mother. Vivian was still frozen in her chair, her emerald gown ruined by champagne, staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor. Mom, Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Mom, do something. Call the lawyers. Tell them it was your idea. Tell them you forced me to sign the property valuations. Mom, look at me. Vivian did not move. She did not even blink. She was completely broken. Her empire reduced to ashes in less than 10 minutes. She had nothing left to offer him. Jamal realized he was entirely alone. The realization snapped the final remaining thread of his sanity. A raw, guttural scream tore out of his throat, a sound of pure, violent desperation. He whipped his head back toward Chloe. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, fixed entirely on the woman who had handed his life over to the federal government. I will kill you, Jamal roared. He lunged. He vaulted directly across the wide expanse of the mahogany conference table, his hands outstretched like claws aimed directly at Chloe's throat. Papers scattered into the air, water glasses shattered against the polished wood. Chloe shrieked, throwing her arms up over her face and scrambling backward in her heavy leather chair. Jamal never even made it halfway across the table. Desmond's security team moved faster than a human eye could track. Two massive guards intercepted Jamal mid-lunge. They grabbed him by the belt and the collar of his suit jacket, brutally yanking him backward off the table. Jamal thrashed wildly, kicking and screaming, but the guards effortlessly slammed him spine first into the glass wall of the boardroom. The impact rattled the entire room, forcing the air out of Jamal's lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The guards pinned him there, effectively neutralizing the last remaining threat in the room. I did not move from the CEO chair. I simply watched him struggle against the glass, looking down at the street below. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of heavy boots echoed from the carpeted hallway outside. The sound grew deafeningly loud, drowning out Jamal's frantic, breathless curses. The heavy oak boardroom doors burst open with explosive, violent force. A flood of heavily armed Atlanta Police Department officers poured into the room, their tactical gear contrasting sharply with the opulent surroundings. They moved with absolute precision, fanning out to secure the perimeter. Right behind them, 3 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the FBI insignia printed across the back stepped into the boardroom. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with graying temples, locked eyes with Desmond. Desmond gave a sharp, definitive nod. The agent stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of warrants from his jacket. Jamal Malik and Vivian Sterling, the agent announced, his voice booming over the chaos of the room. You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, and federal embezzlement. Chloe Sterling, you are under arrest for federal tax evasion. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands over my child, and watched the handcuffs come out. The execution was complete. The cold, heavy click of steel ratcheting around Malik's wrists cut sharply through the panicked atmosphere of the boardroom. The lead detective from the Atlanta Police Department did not hesitate or offer any polite warnings. He yanked Malik's arms securely behind his back, reciting the Miranda rights with a bored, practiced monotony that completely dehumanized the once arrogant heir. Malik did not resist the arrest. He simply stared blankly at the mahogany floorboards, his entire body trembling violently as the officers aggressively patted him down for weapons. The reality of his federal embezzlement charges had completely short-circuited his nervous system. Across the room, Chloe was putting up a spectacularly pathetic fight. She thrashed against the two female officers, attempting to restrain her, her rented scarlet dress tearing audibly at the shoulder seam. She shrieked wildly about her social status, demanding they unhand her immediately, claiming she was a victim of a massive financial misunderstanding. A federal agent calmly stepped directly into her line of sight, holding up a printed transcript of her offshore wire transfer authorization. The sight of her own signature on the tax evasion documents silenced her instantly. The fight drained completely out of her body, replaced by a suffocating, hyperventilating terror as the handcuffs locked tight over her wrists. Jamal was still pinned against the thick glass window overlooking the city. He was spitting fury, his face contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure rage. Two FBI agents hauled him away from the glass, forcing his arms downward with practiced physical authority. He fought them tooth and nail, leveraging his weight, screaming that he was the CEO of Sterling Real Estate and that his expensive defense lawyers would have their badges stripped by noon. The agents were entirely unimpressed by his elite tantrums. They slammed him face down onto the surface of the grand conference table right on top of his fraudulent SEC ledgers and locked him in irons. The hollow sound of his cheek hitting the polished wood was incredibly satisfying. I remained seated at the head of the table watching the flawless execution of my design. The room smelled of spilled vintage champagne, expensive cologne, and sheer, unfiltered fear. Then my gaze shifted to the corner of the room. Vivian was backed tightly into the angle where the glass wall met the mahogany paneling. She was pressing her spine into the corner as if she could somehow merge with the architecture and physically disappear from the crime scene. The emerald green designer gown she had flaunted just minutes earlier now hung awkwardly on her shrinking, terrified frame. The heavy, ostentatious diamond necklace at her throat suddenly looked like a glittering, restrictive noose. A female officer stepped toward her, unhooking a fresh pair of steel cuffs from her heavy-duty belt. Vivian threw her hands up, palms facing outward in a frantic, trembling gesture of refusal. She looked wildly around the room. She watched Malik being hauled roughly toward the door. She watched Jamal cursing and spitting against the conference table. She watched Chloe weeping silently into the expensive carpet. Her empire was entirely gone. Her stolen wealth was completely frozen. Her pristine high society image was currently being dismantled piece by piece in front of heavily armed strangers. Vivian's eyes finally snapped to me. She stared at the woman she had mercilessly tormented for years. The woman she had mocked for lacking generational wealth. The woman she had actively conspired to throw off a hotel terrace like disposable garbage. She saw me sitting in the seat of absolute undeniable power, completely untouched by the legal carnage unfolding around me. The survival instinct of a desperate, cornered narcissist is a truly remarkable thing to witness in real time. Vivian's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, the heavy silk of her emerald gown pooling around her in a tragic, messy puddle. She ignored the police officer standing directly over her. She ignored the screams of her incarcerated sons. She began to crawl forward on the floor, her hands sliding right over the shattered glass of her dropped champagne flute. She did not even care that the sharp crystal fragments were cutting deeply into her palms. She dragged herself across the expensive carpet until she was just a few feet away from my chair. "Kiara, please," Vivian wailed, her voice a ragged, ugly sound that tore violently through her throat. I looked down at her. She was weeping openly, dark trails of expensive waterproof mascara running down her flushed, panicked face. The woman who had spent decades meticulously cultivating an aura of untouchable supremacy was now groveling on the floor like a common street criminal. This pathetic, desperate display shattered her pristine high society image permanently. It proved exactly what I had known all along from the very first day I met her. Vivian Sterling was absolutely nothing without the money she had stolen from innocent people. Strip away the sprawling mansions, the elite designer labels, and the exclusive country club memberships, and she was just an empty, vicious bully, completely terrified of facing the consequences of her own actions. Please, Vivian begged, clasping her bleeding hands together tightly in front of her chest. We are family. You cannot do this to us. I am the baby's grandmother. That is my blood inside of you. You cannot let them take everything away from us. We will give you whatever you want. We will sign all the commercial properties over to you. Just call the federal agents off. Please, Kiara, do it for the sake of your child. Her active attempt to weaponize my unborn baby was the final defining proof of her irredeemable toxic nature. She had happily tried to murder this exact child when she shoved me over the stone terrace railing 6 months ago. Now facing a concrete prison cell and total financial ruin, she was trying to use that exact same child as a bargaining chip to secure her freedom. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of the heavy leather CEO chair. I pushed myself up, rising slowly and deliberately to my feet. The entire room seemed to quiet down as I stood to my full height. The police officers automatically paused their processing instinctively, recognizing the absolute shift in the power dynamic. I stepped away from the conference table, looking down at the weeping, shattered matriarch bleeding at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt entirely cleansed. I walked slowly toward her, the sound of my heels deliberate and sharp against the mahogany floorboards. Vivian looked up at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope. She genuinely believed her theatrical performance might actually work. She genuinely believed that because I was once the good, quiet girl she had originally hired to marry her son, I would somehow fold under the emotional pressure of her tears. She forgot that she had violently killed that girl on the terrace. I stopped right in front of her, forcing her to crane her neck upward to look at my face. I maintained perfect, icy composure, letting her sit in the agonizing silence before delivering the final strike. You wanted to protect the family legacy, Vivian. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried to every single corner of the silent boardroom. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Vivian held her breath, nodding frantically, waiting for a miraculous reprieve that was never coming. Congratulations, I said, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I am officially withdrawing the Vanguard equity buyout offer. The deal is dead. Your business is entirely bankrupt. Your estate is scheduled to be foreclosed on tomorrow morning by the banks you defrauded. And your sons are going to federal prison. The remaining sliver of hope in Vivian's eyes extinguished instantly. Her mouth opened in a silent scream of pure, unending despair. She lunged forward, trying to desperately grab the hem of my maternity coat, but the female officer moved instantly. The officer grabbed Vivian forcefully by the shoulders, hauling her roughly to her feet and slamming her against the glass wall to secure her wrists in heavy iron cuffs. Vivian thrashed wildly against the glass, screaming my name over and over again, her voice cracking into a hysterical screech that rattled the boardroom windows. Jamal heard his mother screaming and began fighting the FBI agents anew, demanding they let her go, yelling that Vanguard had signed a binding financial contract and that I was breaking the law. Desmond stepped smoothly to my side, holding open the thick manila folder containing the voided acquisition documents. He handed me the heavy gold pen. I took it, flipped to the final signature page, and drew a massive aggressive line directly through the buyer agreement, legally killing their final hope. I tossed the ruined contract onto the floor directly at Vivian's feet. The legacy is over, I said quietly, turning my back on the screaming woman. I looked toward the door. The heavily armed officers were systematically dragging the ruined Sterling family out of the boardroom. Chloe went first, sobbing loudly, her expensive heels dragging uselessly against the carpet as she was marched toward the elevators. Malik followed, head down, completely broken and defeated by the crushing reality of his impending incarceration. Jamal was next, physically carried out by two large federal agents, his face bright red with exertion as he shouted empty, meaningless legal threats back into the room. Finally, they hauled Vivian toward the exit. She dragged her feet, fighting the officers every single step of the way, turning her head to burn her hateful, tear-streaked gaze into my memory. Her screaming faded into a muffled, pathetic echo as they pulled her into the hallway and forced her toward the service elevators. The heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off the noise entirely. The boardroom was suddenly incredibly quiet. The only sound left was the low hum of the climate control system and the distant fading wail of the police sirens echoing off the city streets below. The room was an absolute disaster zone of scattered financial papers, spilled vintage champagne, and shattered glass. But to me, it looked like the most beautiful landscape I had ever seen. Desmond stood near the conference table, silently packing the remaining operational documents back into his leather briefcase. He snapped the brass locks shut and turned to face me, offering a stiff, deeply respectful nod. "The extraction is complete, Madam CEO," Desmond reported softly. "The local authorities have secured all targets. Our legal team is filing the bankruptcy petitions with the federal court right now. The asset freeze is absolute. They have exactly zero capital left to mount a defense." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The morning sun was bright and blinding, washing the city in a fresh golden light. I placed my hand gently over my stomach, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the quiet air. The crushing weight I had carried in my chest for 6 long months was entirely gone. The fear, the anger, the desperate need for justice had all been burned away, leaving behind a profound, untouchable peace. Vivian Sterling's agonizing, ragged screams echoed off the thick, soundproofed glass of the executive boardroom, but they fell on entirely deaf ears. I stood near the heavy oak doors, completely motionless, watching the absolute and total disintegration of a woman who had built her entire identity on the brutal subjugation of others. The federal agents had left her for last, methodically processing her asset seizure paperwork, while she knelt amidst the wreckage of her fractured empire. She clutched her rented emerald green designer purse tightly to her chest, her knuckles white and shaking desperately, trying to hold on to the last tangible symbol of her wealth. But even that was a fabricated lie. I had run the financial diagnostics during the Vanguard equity audit. The purse was a seasonal rental, just like the gown she was wearing, just like the leased luxury vehicles currently being impounded by federal authorities in the subterranean hotel parking garage. Her entire existence was a carefully curated, heavily financed mirage, and the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of federal justice were finally burning it all away. She looked up at me from the mahogany floorboards, her face a smeared, grotesque canvas of ruined waterproof makeup and pure, unadulterated terror. Her sons, the heirs she had ruthlessly groomed to dominate the Atlanta real estate market and manipulate the legal system, were gone. They had been dragged through the service corridors in heavy steel cuffs just moments prior. Jamal's frantic, cowardly bargaining and Malik's pathetic, high-pitched whimpering had been the definitive soundtrack to her downfall. She was now completely stripped of her family, her stolen wealth, and the precious elite social standing she worshipped above oxygen itself. The Buckhead elite, the women she played tennis with at the country club and gossiped alongside at high society charity galas, would read the unsealed federal indictments before they even finished their morning coffee. By noon today, the Sterling name would be entirely radioactive. Vivian was now a ghost haunting her own ruined life. I did not offer her a parting word of false sympathy. I did not stoop to deliver a final, gloating monologue. The total icy silence from my end was the ultimate crushing condemnation. I turned my back on Vivian Sterling and walked slowly out of the executive boardroom. Desmond fell into step perfectly beside me, his long, measured strides matching my calculated pace. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind us with a final echoing thud, effectively sealing Vivian inside her self-made glass-walled tomb. The air in the penthouse corridor felt immediately lighter, stripped of the toxic, suffocating arrogance that always accompanied the Sterling family. We walked down the thick, plush corridor carpet, passing the expensive, abstract art installations and the muted gold wall sconces. 6 months ago, walking these exact same halls, I had felt like a total imposter. I had been a working-class outsider, desperately trying to contort myself into a shape that would satisfy Jamal's elitist demanding family. I used to keep my head down, acutely aware of my sensible shoes and off-the-rack blazers shrinking under the judgmental weight of this opulent billionaire environment. Now the corridor felt entirely different. It felt like my personal territory. We reached the main lobby, the grand Italian marble expanse gleaming brilliantly under the massive cascading crystal chandeliers. As we approached the primary exit, the shift in the atmospheric dynamic was instantaneous and incredibly palpable. During my brief, miserable marriage to Jamal, the St. Regis Hotel staff had treated me with a barely concealed polite disdain. They had taken their behavioral cues directly from Vivian, viewing me as the unfortunate, unsophisticated charity case attached to the wealthy sterling heir. I vividly remembered the head concierge who had once rolled his eyes when I politely asked for a replacement room keycard. I remembered the master sommelier, who had openly sneered at my inexpensive wine selections during family dinners. I remembered the front desk manager who always directed his warm, fawning greetings exclusively to Jamal while looking right through my chest as if I were completely invisible. Today their behavior was drastically, almost comically different. The news of the Vanguard equity buyout and the subsequent highly visible federal raid in the penthouse boardroom had clearly rippled through the hotel's internal communication network with lightning speed. As I walked purposefully across the marble floor, the staff physically scrambled to get out of my direct path. The same concierge who had once dismissed me nearly tripped over his own polished leather shoes to race forward and hold open the heavy brass and glass doors. He bowed his head deeply, his eyes cast respectfully downward in absolute submission, not daring to make direct eye contact with the billionaire CEO who had just orchestrated the most ruthless, devastating corporate takeover in the city's history. The front desk manager stood frozen at attention behind his counter, his face pale with terrified respect. They were bowing to the phantom they had once actively tried to erase. They realized far too late that true power did not scream in rented designer gowns or throw drunken tantrums in the lobby. Power moved quietly, carrying a solid gold fountain pen and sealed federal indictments. I stepped across the threshold and out into the crisp, biting Atlanta air. The morning chill washed over my face, carrying the faint, familiar scent of Georgia pine and city exhaust. It was incredibly, profoundly refreshing. I stopped at the top of the sweeping stone stairs, looking down at the bustling, sunlit street. 6 months ago, I had been scraping my broken, bleeding body off cold concrete, just a few blocks from this exact location, fighting for every single ragged breath, while the people who promised to protect me calculated their illicit insurance payout. But standing here now, wrapped in my tailored cashmere maternity coat, there was no lingering trauma. There were no dark ghosts haunting the periphery of my vision. There were no anxious backward glances at the people who had tried to break me. The past was completely dead, permanently buried under mountains of ironclad legal documents, frozen bank accounts, and federal prison sentences. I felt nothing but absolute crystalline clarity and unyielding strength. I placed my hand gently over my stomach, pressing against the fine wool of my coat. The baby responded almost immediately, delivering a strong, forceful, reassuring kick against my palm. A deep, quiet smile broke across my face, the first genuine expression I had allowed myself all morning. I looked out at the towering skyscrapers of the financial district, the glittering monuments to wealth and ambition. I had not just survived the fall. I had climbed back up the sheer cliff face, rewritten the fundamental laws of gravity, and bought the entire mountain. I did not just defeat the Sterling family. I owned the very ground they walked on. I owned the banks that held their crushing debt, the ledgers that proved their crimes, and the very narrative they had tried to use to destroy me. My child would never know the sting of Vivian's conditional love or Jamal's pathetic cowardice. My child would be born into an empire built on absolute, unshakable truth. Desmond moved to the bottom of the stone steps, smoothly opening the reinforced bulletproof door of the idling black SUV. The heavy engine purred smoothly, a low, powerful vibration waiting to be unleashed onto the highway. I descended the stairs with a steady, confident grace and stepped into the warm, pristine leather interior of the chauffeured car, settling comfortably into the plush back seat. Desmond closed the heavy door with a solid, finalizing thud, sealing us inside our private moving fortress. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly and aggressively into the heavy Atlanta morning traffic, I looked out the tinted window one last time. The grand, imposing facade of the St. Regis Hotel faded rapidly into the distance. It took the ashes of my abuser's fake rented legacy with it, leaving it entirely in the rearview mirror as we drove steadily toward a flawless, untouchable future. True power is not found in inherited wealth or performative cruelty. It is forged in the silent, unrelenting pursuit of self-worth and absolute independence. When a toxic family environment tries to bury you, use that very dirt to plant the seeds of your own empire. The most profound justice is not merely watching your abusers fall, but rising so high that their shadows can no longer reach you. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own incredible success? Share your journey of reclaiming your power in the comment section below and subscribe.